All right, let's take a look at Module 5, which deals with vulnerability analysis. And this is actually part of the scanning process for all intents and purposes. But with CH version 9, we actually separated that from the scanning module, and it became its own module, vulnerability analysis. So the vulnerability management concept, it's an ongoing process, right? You're never going to be fully invulnerable. All vulnerabilities remediated. They're always being discovered. They're always being patched, and it's an ongoing process. The vulnerability scan in the hacking cycle is a pre-exploitation step, part of the scanning operation, and it's used to determine potential vulnerabilities to compromise the system. Later on in the deliverable, the pen testing report, you're going to recommend the remediation measures. So this is a concept, an ongoing process, and a step in the sequence of events that lead up to system exploitation. So we will be taking a look at a couple vulnerability scans, and we're going to turn those findings into an exploit selection and tee things up for our gaining access phase that we'll be addressing in the next module in system hacking. All right, so first off, riddle me this. What is a vulnerability? A vulnerability is anything that can be exploited that leads to a compromise of confidentiality, integrity, or availability. The existence of a weakness in an asset that can be exploited by threat agents. Hardware or software misconfigurations, including default configurations, insecure or poor network design or application design, inherent technology weaknesses, and careless approach of end users, which is always a big one. Now, we're going to start approaching the discussions of poor coding practices and inadequate security measures during the development cycle. And it sounds like we put a lot of the blame on some of these vulnerabilities on the developers. Now, in all fairness, developers have a lot on their plate without having to worry about security historically. It's not been historically their responsibility. So you ask any old school developer, and I'm talking old school like Fortran, COBOL, Pascal, that sort of stuff, how much of your training dealt with security? They'd be like little to none. So it hasn't been historically their responsibility. Nowadays, we have to bake it into the software development lifecycle. So now we're into secure coding practices and DevSecOps and so forth, and different types of frameworks. So there's a lot of reference to poor coding practices, but there's also a lot of issues with the securing the software once it's been installed. So again, historically, we've had this crunchy on the outside, chewy on the inside mentality, and we're baking security into the development process. So the concepts of vulnerabilities and buffer overflows and so forth, a lot of times the developers just not been taught to think about that. And again, nowadays in modern disciplines that they are. So not blaming anything on the developers is what I'm trying to drive at there. I got nothing but respect for developers. I am not one. I wish my coding abilities were a lot more proficient than they are. But anyway, so nothing but respect and love for the developers. All right, examples of vulnerabilities. TCP/IP protocol. Everything you can think of protocol-wise is clear text by default. Almost everything. Name a protocol, it's probably clear text, and it has been for years. We're going to readdress all of that in the sniffing module, and we'll talk about how to protect it, which is typically using some sort of encryption. Operating system vulnerabilities, there's bugs in the OS. The bugs get fixed by patching. A lack of patching means the bugs remain, and we will talk about patch management in a later module. But you're supposed to keep up on your patches, and before you deploy them, you have to adequately test them. So we're typically always behind the curve a bit on what patches are available and how quickly that they're being actually applied. Network device vulnerabilities, lack of password protection, authentication, insecure protocols. Okay, user account vulnerabilities, insecure transmission of user account details, which a lot of the stuff we're going to see firsthand in the system hacking module. System account vulnerabilities, weak passwords for system accounts, internet service misconfiguration, default passwords and settings, we've talked about that, and network device misconfiguration, for example, default SNMP community strings, which we talked about in the last module. All right, so those are a few examples, and really anything that can be exploited is a vulnerability, plain and simple. All right, vulnerability research is the concept of, well, researching, not necessarily discovering for the first time, known vulnerabilities. There are websites and databases that are dedicated to the cataloging of known vulnerabilities, and we're going to be taking a look at a couple of those in the lecture. We'll be taking a look at some in the labs as well. But the idea here is that the administrator doesn't have to start from scratch. They can use resources that have compilations of previously known vulnerabilities. They can compare that against the systems in their environment, determine whether or not those vulnerabilities are present, and whether or not they need to be remediated. Now, actually, if there's a vulnerability, you automatically assume it needs to be remediated, but there's still cost-benefit analysis and still adequate testing. So in a nutshell, vulnerability analysis is cataloging everything in your infrastructure, software versions with as much specificity as possible, and then looking up what known exploits exist for those vulnerabilities and those vulnerabilities in the known exploits. So we will take a look at common vulnerabilities and exposures, National Vulnerability Database, and other security research websites. But the administrator needs vulnerability research to be, first off, educated on the existence, and more importantly, educated on how to remediate or remove the vulnerability or reduce the exposure. So again, ongoing project. All right, resources for vulnerability research. Some of the more notable online resources: PacketStorm, fantastic; Dark Reading, fantastic; Trend Micro, Security Magazine, Pentest Magazine, all great resources. But these are not typically the standard references like the CVE, Microsoft security bulletins that we actually use as a reference or labeling or index numbers that are formally applied to vulnerability scanners and other types of SCAP mechanisms, which we won't get much into that in this course. But there are a variety of online resources, and probably the most fundamental are the CVE and Microsoft, the National Vulnerability Database, CERT sites, which participate in the collection, cataloging, and sharing of discovered vulnerability information. And I'm going to show you an example. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and do my standard vulnerability assessment and vulnerability analysis lecture. I'm not going to configure the vulnerability scan. I've got a pie already baked in the oven, so to speak, and you're going to get plenty of hands-on configuring your scan in OpenBOSS in the lab. But I've already run a Nessus scan, and I want to show you the variance between older and newer systems. All right, this also gives us a visual reference for CVE, Microsoft security bulletins, etc. So we go to bring up my scans. All right, I've got a few scans already run. I've got a demo scan, which is a single host against a really, really vulnerable box. That's an unpatched Windows 2000. Look at all that vulnerability. But I'm contrasting that with my demo 2, which is a scan of my entire subnet. Now, you can actually see the window of opportunity for network-based exploitation has diminished with each iteration of the Windows operating system. So when you look back at my original victim system, when I originally started teaching CH, originally in 2005, that box was full of vulnerabilities and still is. I haven't patched it. Obviously, the vulnerabilities accumulate. But I keep that around as a proof of concept and demonstration box because it gives us lots of stuff to look at in one target. But you can see as the years have gone on and newer OSs come out, you see a lot less of that red, which is network exploitable or critical vulnerabilities. So my 2008 and 2012, you see that red just drying up, and then the 2019 box has got 0 criticals. So the rating of the criticality of the vulnerability is based directly on the resultant impact if it's exploited. And we have descriptions. I'm going to run through all that. But I like having a nice memory lane lab environment here where we can go back and look at older versions of OSs and contrast and see where we've come from. So all that really means is when I scan a fully patched 2019, 2022 machine, there's probably not much exploitable from the network. I'm going to have to shift from missiles to guns, so to speak, and I'm going to have to go after client-side exploitation or web applications. So in the glory days, we had lots of network endpoint listeners, exploitable vulnerabilities. There's a lot less of that these days, and it just gets tighter and tighter. So that's a vulnerability scan across my entire subnet. Now, I'm going to revisit that here in just a second, but I want to kind of set the stage for our discussions of common vulnerabilities and exposures, Microsoft security bulletins. So I run a scanning tool. That scanning tool automatically identifies the live systems, the open ports, the operating systems. So that seems an awful lot like what we did in scanning. It is. It does a lot of the discovery that Nmap does, but then it takes it to the next level and it runs a variety of plugins which are configured to probe for specifics, indicators of vulnerabilities. Network vulnerabilities, application services vulnerabilities, configuration errors. There's actually configuration issues, and then there's vulnerability issues, and there's a couple different databases that have a little bit of a different catalog of different types of issues. So my vulnerability scan, let's go ahead and pick the example that I've been using for years. This was one of the nastiest vulnerabilities of all time, and I still use it as a talking point for my discussion of exploitable vulnerability. But the old RPC DCOM exploit, this is affected all Windows systems. The security bulletin is the MS03026 Microsoft RPC interface overrun. Now, that was one of many catastrophic vulnerabilities over the years. So we had MS03026, which was like the big one when I first started teaching this course. We have MS08067, which was huge. That was about mid-range 2008 boxes. And then we had the MS17010 Eternal Blue and its variants, which affected earlier versions of server message block protocol. But I'm going to use this as our example. Now, this is, again, long since been patched. You won't typically find any systems vulnerable to this, and you're probably not going to find a lot of Windows 2000 systems out there. But you will still find 2003, XP, and other unsupported operating systems. And this is meant to kind of show you what would be possible with those legacy systems, especially in OT, SCADA types of environments. You have a lot of legacy systems that rely heavily on the fact that they're on closed networks. But if you can get to them, this sort of thing might be an option. And I'll run the same vulnerability actually against my 2003 just to kind of update a little bit. But that MS03026, the description given is that the remote version of Windows contains a flaw in the function remote activation and its RPC interface that can allow an attacker to execute arbitrary code on the remote host with system privileges. That is horrible. That's very dangerous. You've got complete elevated privilege on the box. When you describe that to an executive and non-technical type, they're like, is that bad? Yeah, that's horrible. On a scale of 1 to 10, that's a 10. So the CVSS base score, the common vulnerability scoring system, gives us on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is it? So everybody understands a 10. That one's probably more like a 10.5 or an 11, considering full access, system privileges, any code I want to execute from a remote listener as long as I can get to port 135. So on a scale of 1 to 10, that's a 10. Everybody understands on a scale of 1 to 10. Now, we're not going to get too much into the temporal scores or the vector scores, but it gives us a rating system. And then there's typically low, medium, high, and criticals as well. The severity level can be ranked in 3 categories. Also, whether or not it's local or remotely exploitable. All right, so for example, the common vulnerability scoring system, we just saw an example. All right, they're actually sourcing that based on NIST.gov. the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures Database, which is maintained by MITRE.org, the National Vulnerability Database, which is maintained by NIST, which has entries for the CV identifiers, and the Common Weakness Enumeration is also a MITRE.org resource. You're going to be running through a lab on the Common Weakness Enumeration. All right, so back to my example. If you scroll on down, you will see the reference information. It's the MS 03026. Now, that is 2003 when it was first discovered, the 26th that year. So a lot of times these indexing systems will have a year of discovery and a number in order of inclusion. Now there's also a bug track ID, which that was mapped to a site called Security Focus, which is no longer maintained by Symantec, much different now, rest in peace, Security Focus. Used to be one of my favorite sites. The Microsoft knowledge base articles that discuss the vulnerability, and there's our CVE identifier, CVE 2003, 352nd that year. When I click on these links, it'll take me out to Microsoft Security Bulletin. It'll take me out to the NIST National Vulnerability Database entry for the 2003 0352. I can also go to the Microsoft knowledge base articles. Nope, got an error on that one. And then the old school bug track ID is going to take me to bug track Security Focus, but this has changed considerably since the earlier version. It's now owned by Accenture versus Symantec. Now I can also manually go to the CVE at MITRE.org. I can also manually go to the National Vulnerability Database, which we've already got a link open there. And I can also manually go to the exploit database, which here's where things get interesting. CVE again. All right, this is where I actually select my exploits. So back to MITRE.org. All right, if you go to downloads or view all items HTML, it takes you back to the first entry, 1999-0001. So if nothing else, this gives us a master index number that can be cross-referenced on other sites. The CVE entry itself usually really doesn't give you much to go on. Got a description, okay, remote denial of service, crash or hang via crafted packets. It really doesn't tell me exactly how to do it, but it gives me lots of different references to other discussions. All right, if I go to, again, the 2003-0352 NIST entry, that gives me a little bit more information and a bunch of links to additional discussions. All right, some of these links will take you to proof of concept exploitation tools like ExploitDB. If I search on 2003, 0352, there'll be 3 entries for the RPC DCOM interface overrun. And if I click on it, it's going to take me to a download location, which again, bug track, I gotta subscribe to. Let me back up there. Let's go back one. Or the Metasploit source code to install in Metasploit. And there's the Ruby script. So there's your weapon. So in order to exploit this, here's the proof of concept code just to prove it's exploitable, but there's your weapon. So what was to stop me from downloading this as just an average human on planet Earth? Absolutely nothing. So this stuff is out there for proof of concept, which means it's out there for exploitation. All right, so that's the CVE, that's the NVD, CWE, and again, Microsoft Security Research website. So there's plenty of resources out there, but once you've proved it's exploitable, the next step is to fix it based on the recommendations for remediation, which a lot of times is installing a patch. Patches, of course, need to be tested adequately, and we'll discuss patch management a little bit later on. All right, so that vulnerability is now also exploitable with Metasploit Canvas, or Core Impact. All right, Metasploit, like we mentioned in the previous module, is our primary pen testing framework, pen testing tool set. It has lots of built-in exploits, lots of scanner options, and it already has this MS-03026 built in. So let's take a look at that. All right, on my Parrot security box, I'm going to fire up an application called Armitage, which is a graphical front end for Metasploit. All right, go ahead and connect. I'm also going to run through the exploit selection on a vintage version of the Metasploit GUI on my old BT4 machine. All right, so this was Kali Linux and Parrot when I first started teaching CH years ago, before it was even called Kali, on backtrack versions. But this MSF GUI's got a vintage feel to it. Check that out, the whole Grand Theft Auto splash screen. And it's a very simple configuration of the exploit and the payload and the execution. So I like to use this for the initial demonstration because it's very simple, very straightforward, and it's 2-3 components and you're done. All right, when I search Metasploit MS-03026, there's the DCE RPC MS-03026. Double click on it. It wants me to select my target, which sometimes there's multiple options, multiple service packs. We only have one option. Click forward. All right, then the payload. So this is a buffer overflow. Once I have flooded the buffer and I've smashed the stack, then I need to change the address pointers to point to payload or shellcode. And here's where you select what you want it to do. So I could, for example, get a reverse command shell, but I'm going to choose something a little bit more GUIfied. We'll do a VNC inject reverse TCP. This will connect back to the attacker at the specified IP address, inject a VNC server DLL, which gives me a remote desktop, and then run it from memory. So completely diskless, memory resident injection. I'll click forward. I'll specify the remote host, 10.0.0.200. Whoops. The remote port 135, which from our enumeration discussion in the previous module, we know that that's the RPC endpoint mapper, remote procedure call. Localhost is me for the connect back, the VNC port, the local port for the connect back, automatically launch the VNC viewer. Forward, and then apply. All right, VNC inject, boom, we got a desktop. All right, now again, that's a dated vulnerability, proof of concept. I've got something still up from my last SQL injection discussion. So most systems these days will be vulnerable to that. We're going to talk about other ways to exploit a system. When we get to system hacking, I've got a couple other examples as well, but that's the vintage exploit I like to use for the initial demo. I'm going to shut that down. Now, another easier way to do that, using, say, Armitage, exploit Windows, DCE RPC, there's the MS-03026. And this time I'll compromise my 2003 box. Lightning. All right, I've got a few others for like the 2008, but the SMB, MS-010, Eternal Blue, kind of a big one. This one doesn't fire every time either. We still didn't like it. There we go. So that's the MS17 internal blue, which is what like WannaCry and Petra is based on. So that's kind of a big one. All right, and notice I've got a workspace here now full of exploitable systems and actually exploited systems. You could be running your whole dashboard here from compromised hosts and interacting, but I'm going to hold off on any further demonstration here because this is all stuff we talk about in the system hacking module. And really all I'm driving at right now is the discovery of the vulnerability. I actually already took it a little bit further than we needed to. All right, so there's the vulnerability scoring systems and databases. And again, the idea here is you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to find vulnerabilities for the first time. You look them up. Here's what we know about. Here's what to look for. Here's how you remediate. And a lot of pen testing can be, I hate to say this out loud, a lot of pen testing is looking for what we already know exists. Now, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of benefit to be had. There we go. From the expertise of the tester, but we have a lot of scanning tools to run, the initial scans, find the vulnerabilities, exploitation tools, and there's a degree of process of elimination for known threats. And then, of course, there's manual scanning, which there's no replacement for the human in the driver's seat of your scanning utilities. But a lot of vulnerability analysis and pen testing is looking for what we already know exists. All right, so the vulnerability management cycle. So we just saw the vulnerability scan as a scanning step that leads up to or is prior to exploitation. So in a pen test or ethical hack, that's where it falls. Vulnerability management or vulnerability assessment as a concept and ongoing activity it's a process. It's constantly in motion, right? Vulnerabilities discovered, today may not have been detected yesterday. So the frequency at which you run your scans, the life cycle for remediation, these are all critical factors in vulnerability management. So we typically break it down into 3 phases. You have the pre-assessment phase, the vulnerability assessment phase, and then the post-assessment phase. So pre-assessment is pretty straightforward. Identify assets to create a baseline. So that's cataloging. What do we have here? Software versions, protocol versions, and so forth. Then you run the scan, which I just showed you an example of the results of the scan. And then the post-assessment phase is what do you do about what you discovered? Assess risk, remediate, verify, monitor, and then boom, you're right back down to the pre-assessment phase and the wheel just goes around and around and around. So ongoing process, you're never finished. All right, so the pre-assessment phase, again, inventory of assets, identify controls, understand the scope, create information protection procedures. Vulnerability assessment phase, run the scan. Select the type of scan. We're going to look at a couple different flavors of scans here in just a second. Examine a physical security, which you don't really scan for physical security. That's hugely important. And one of the most fun aspects of a pen test is to see how far you can intrude on the perimeter before somebody challenges you or stops you. So you can get way into the core of a building before anybody looks at you weird. All right, check for misconfigurations, run vulnerability scans, create the scan report. We're going to take a look at an example of a scan report here in just a bit. All right, then the post-assessment phase, okay, risk assessment. Okay, we've got a vulnerability. Yeah, but it's low on the severity level. It's not a lot of risk. So we could probably put that way down the list of priorities. You want to focus on what's going to cause you the most financial impact is what it boils down to, but the most harm. So the higher base scores, CVSs and so forth need to be addressed first. Your remediation, which is oftentimes installing a patch. Verification, really important. So when you fix the issue, rescan it to verify that it's fixed. And then you're back into ongoing monitoring. So there should be a remediation period in any security assessment where there's a block of time allocated to fix the issues found, and then you come back and recheck just to make sure it's all been remediated. You don't benefit a lot from an assessment if you don't fix the issues, and you don't 100% know it's fixed until you retest after the remediation phase. All right, the types of vulnerability assessment. This actually used to be a little bit of a different layout here in CH version 11, but there's active and there's passive assessments, right? Okay, active means you use a scanner. that's what we're going to be using. Passive means you're just sniffing traffic to find information about active systems, network services, applications, vulnerabilities. Again, if I care about being detected, then I go passive. If I want to get more useful information results, I want to go active, right? If I don't care about getting detected, or I'm not worried about crashing servers and so forth, then I'm going to run active. Now, usually you're not too worried about crashing servers as long as you're not overly aggressive with your scans. But if you get into like SCADA OT environments where they're considered to be a lot more fragile, you can actually drop servers with scans that are too aggressive. So you kind of want to be a little bit more cautious in those types of environments. All right, when we talk about aggressive timings and so forth, it's the rate of information that you inject into the network. And in Nmap, for example, we had the T4 aggressive, and then T5 was insane. You typically want to go about as high as T4. All right, external or internal is pretty straightforward. Either I'm inside the security perimeter or I'm outside the security perimeter. A host-based assessment means you're running a utility locally on the box. So I'm running a configuration level check, identify system configurations, directories, file systems, and so forth, but I'm running it on the local system. A network-based assessment is where you run a scanner. So we're going to run an active assessment using a scanner against the internal or external infrastructure is typically how it plays out. An application assessment is typically referring to web applications, and there's a little bit more of a specialized type of scanner for web applications. Web applications have unique vulnerabilities. Now, tools like Nessus and OpenBOSS can definitely scan for web application vulnerabilities, but you're better off in a lot of cases using a scanner dedicated for or built for web applications. And if you wanted to name, the big kahuna on planet Earth, it's probably still WebInspect. There's Acunetics, there's OpenBOSS, there's NIC2, WIC2. We're going to talk about plenty of those in our web server discussion and web application discussion. So that would be a different type of vulnerability scanner, and those can actually run you some big money, but well worth it due to the amount of work that they do for you and the amount of heavy lifting they do for you. Our database assessment is also typically done through applications. We'll talk more about wireless in the wireless module. Okay, distributed access to the distributed organization's assets, client-server applications. All right, so you can look at the communications between the endpoints and that sort of thing. And then a credentialed or non-credentialed assessment means you're configuring the scanner with usernames and passwords or not. Now, credentialed assessment definitely allows you to view more information on the box, but may give you an unrealistic look at the actual risk or exposure, seeing as how attackers don't necessarily have credentials to scan the box for vulnerabilities. So this would be more of the white box variety of test where you know more about the inner workings of the system than your average attacker would. All right, manual assessment, you're manually running scripts and command line and so forth, assessing vulnerabilities, vulnerability ranking score, etc., just not using an automated tool. And automated means using a scanning tool. So we're going to do a good bit of automated, network-based, active external, internal assessments using utilities like Nessus or OpenBOSS. And I've always been a Nessus guy, so that's what I use for my demos. Qualys, Nessus Professional, GFI LandGuard. Now, Nessus is, once upon a time was free, but of course it went licensed eventually, but you can still, 16 IPs, I think is the current free license. You can still use Nessus for non-professional purposes, scan up to like 16 IPs for free. It's also the core code for like ACAS and other scanning engines, which if you're in DoD or military, you might be familiar with ACAS. All right, OpenBOSS is the open vulnerability assessment scanner. The Greenbone Security Assistant is your interface for it. It's a nice free solution, and your primary lab for this module will be doing scanning using OpenBOSS. So an excellent open source free solution. You can actually download the entire Greenbone virtual machine and run it as a virtual appliance. You can install it on Linux distros, and in your lab environment, you're going to be running that off your Parrot machine. All right, NIC2. NIC2's been around for a long time. NIC2, WIC2, and a few others. A web server assessment tool that looks for potential problems and security vulnerabilities that are web server specific. So again, we're going to have a more focused discussion of web servers and web applications a little bit later in the course. We'll table the rest of those discussions until then. All right, the vulnerability assessment report. The report is going to list what we found and, more importantly, list how to fix it, how to remediate it. So you can walk into your client's environment, run your pen test, slap a report on this, go, man, you guys are like Swiss cheese. This place is awful. They're not going to get a lot of benefit out of that. We found some findings. You have some exposure. Here's how you reduce that exposure. So you always term it in reduction and findings, not are you guys asleep at the wheel here? Look at all this stuff. This is horrible. Never criticize, you just point out. Right? So there may be reasons why those misconfigurations are made. There may be a business case for it. But we show what we could do to improve their security posture through remediations listed for each vulnerability discussed in the report. So the report actually can be extremely verbose and technical or high level or summaristic. And actually on my Nessus, let's go ahead and view the report. I'm going to export the report to an HTML file, and we'll do a custom and select everything, generate the report, and it'll generate an HTML and download it. And there's our report for that specific box. Vulnerabilities by host. And actually, go back to the group. Demo 2, report, HTML. It can be by the host or by the entire scan. There we go. So that's a lot more comprehensive, a lot more pages. But you can see that it gives you the synopsis, the description, see also the solution, which may or may not be included in the version. If you're using like a free version, sometimes the scanner doesn't include the remediation. They want you to pay for the full version. All right, and some of them are fairly general as well. Microsoft has released a patch for it. So there's your deliverable. Now, this may be there, and this is more of a discussion in the CPENT course, which is the formal methodology for pen testing. But you have different types of security assessments, right? You have an audit, which checks for compliance. Hey, are you doing this, doing this, doing this? You have an assessment, which assesses overall posture. You have a vulnerability assessment that specifically looks for vulnerabilities, but doesn't actually exploit them. Then you have a penetration test that comes in and actually exploits the vulnerabilities. And those happen in different flavors and shapes and sizes: black box, gray box, white box, announced, unannounced, et cetera, et cetera. But the pen test is proving the exploitability of the discovered vulnerabilities. They can't be explained away or, as false positives, dismissed as false positives. And then you also suggest, here's how you remediate. And then you give 2-week period, month period, however, scaled out the test was, to remediate the issues, and then you come back and retest to assure that they've actually been addressed. So that's what a vulnerability scan looks like. So again, the whole concept of vulnerability scan can be an ongoing process versus just an event. And in the hacking cycle, it's one step in the scanning phase that leads to exploit selection, exploitation. All right, so the components of the assessment report: executive summaries in general are usually fairly high level brief overviews, assessment, the findings, risk assessment, recommendations. Okay, these are all, the salient features of an assessment report. And then you've also got varying degrees of technical verbosity based on the intended audience. So executives, you try not to use too much technical lingo. Technical reports, you let the specifics, the vulnerability, the CB identifiers, and so forth, and you get a little bit more descriptive. All right, so that's going to wrap up our vulnerability analysis module. which is, again, one more step along the way to gaining access, maintaining access, and covering tracks, which we'll be addressing in the next module. So module 6 deals with system hacking. We're going to be running through steps 3 through 5 of the hacking cycle. We've actually already done some of that exploitation, so we'll back it off a little bit. We'll revisit some of the stuff we just demoed here as part of our system hacking discussion. But in the meantime, you got a couple labs on vulnerability assessment, great labs, common vulnerabilities and exposures, the OpenVAS utility. So enjoy the labs, and we'll see you back here for module 6, system hacking.